Have you ever looked around at the world, had this thought, why does injustice seem to win? Well, that's the same cry Old Testament prophets answered for us. Israel was being persecuted and God's people were suffering, and it looked like the wicked had the upper hand, so to speak. This week, we're reading through Joel to Nahum, and a message theme is clear in all of this. God's justice will prevail. His mercy is always greater than the judgment that we see. I'm Pastor Ryan. This is Bible in a Year. Now, if you're following along, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like this video, share more so that people can go along in this journey with us. And let's get into this theme of injustice, mercy, and God's judgment prevailing over the goodness of our lives. Now, as we read through the prophets together, these minor prophets, there's some highlights I want us to see and how God answers our deepest cry for justice. Let's talk about the day of the Lord. In the book of Joel, he describes this devastating locust plague as a picture of God's coming judgment. Yet in the middle of that despair, God promises to pour out his spirit on all people. And this is the balance that we see throughout these books that we read. Judgment for sin, but mercy for those who return to God. It reminds us that even when injustice looks overwhelming in life, God is working toward restoration. The next major highlight here is God's justice over nations. We see in Amos, Obadiah, and Nahum, these prophets, they speak not only to Israel, but also against these surrounding nations like Edom, Assyria, and others. And they show us that no nation is beyond God's oversight. Corruption, pride, oppression will always face God's justice. And for us today, it's a great reminder that these rise and fall of nations are never random. God sees every injustice that takes place, and he holds the final word. And the last major highlight for this week is God's mercy for his people. Micah's prophecies, they don't end with judgment. Like Hosea before him, he shows that God's heart is always for restoration. Hosea used the image of a broken marriage to reveal God's covenant mercy. Micah carries that same message forward here. In Micah 6:8, we see God calling his people to live out justice, mercy, and humility, which is an invitation to return to covenant faithfulness grounded in God's unfailing love. Now let's go over some key themes that we're going to run across as we read these chapters, these books this week. The first key theme being the day of the Lord. Joel emphasizes the coming of the day of the Lord. It's a time of both judgment and renewal. Locusts, they devastated the land, yet Joel calls people to repentance, promising that God will pour out his spirit on all flesh. And this theme reminds us that while God's judgment is real, his mercy and restoration are always available when his people turn back to him in repentance. Next, we come across the theme of God's sovereignty over nations. Nahum is going to proclaim judgment over Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, just like Jonah did. And this shows that even the mightiest empires are going to fall under God's hand if he chooses. While Assyria once oppressed Israel, God demonstrates that no power on earth can outlast his justice. And this theme reassures us today that the world events are not random. Every kingdom, every nation, and every ruler is under accountability to the Lord. Now let's switch our understanding of what we're reading here to a supernatural worldview. Because when we read Joel through Nahum this week, through this lens, we're going to see more than stories or historical events. The prophets consistently pull back the curtain here to reveal the behind the scenes, so to speak, of the droughts, the armies, the judgments, and the spiritual realities of everything. God is not only addressing here nations, but also confronting the unseen forces of idolatry and rebellion and pride that have enslaved his people. Take Joel's promise that God would pour out his spirit on all flesh, or Micah's vision of nations streaming to the mountain of the Lord. These are not just poetic images, they are glimpses into God's plan to restore his people by his spirit. or even Nahum's prophecy against Nineveh reminds us that these fall of the empires here are tied to God's sovereign justice over both visible and invisible powers. And the practical takeaway is this: as you read these prophets, do not limit your view to what happens on the ground. Read through heaven's lens, so to speak, and see how God is always working behind the spiritual realm to bring redemption and ultimately point us to Christ. So what does this mean for us today as we read these books? In a world full of corruption and what seems like injustice, these prophets remind us that God is both just and merciful. He sees what others overlook. He defends the weak, and his plan for redemption is always unfolding even when it feels a lot like it's chaotic. And here's the challenge: when we see injustice in the world, or maybe in your own life, don't lose hope. Remember that God's justice will always, always prevail, and his mercy is still offered for those who turn to him. May God bless you as you read this week. I pray that this word brings both conviction and comfort.